Okay, we are back and we're going into the 12th chapter of 1 Samuel this week. If you remember, last week we took chapter 11, and this was all about this king named Nachash, the Ammonite, and how he ended up coming to this city that we talked about. And it's called Jabesh Gilead, and how that there was an agreement made that the men that were there, if they would surrender to Nachash, but the terms were that they had to have the right eye gouged out. And of course, what happens is that they wait 7 days, sending messengers out the first day. This goes to Saul. He hears about it. He's in the field plowing and he hears a commotion inside the city. So he comes and asks what's going on. And of course, he's told that they're going to, by the 7th day, have to surrender and have their right eye gouged out. And we talked about all the potential connections there and the fact that, it's another example, I believe, in that chapter of another remez, a mystery embedded into the text. But this week we're in 1 Samuel 12. So let's read verses 1 through 5. It says, Then Samuel said to all Israel, remember they met and gathered at Gilgal, and he talked to them, that is Samuel did, at Gilgal. So they're still at Gilgal when this next chapter, our chapter, starts, okay? So he says, Behold, I have listened to your voice in that all you said to me, and I've appointed a king over you. And now here's the king walking before you. But I am old and gray, and behold, my sons are with you, and I've walked before you from my youth even to this day. Here I am. I said, and he says, bear witness against me before the Lord and his anointed. And what he means by that, of course, is show me where I've been wrong towards you, okay? He said, whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? I will restore it to you. In other words, if I've really done it, but you didn't, I'll restore it to you. And they said, you have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand. And he said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day that you have found nothing in my hand. And they said, he is witness. So the question, of course, that we're going to have to answer here is, why is it important, and what is the purpose of Samuel going through this? Is it just because he wants to glorify himself somehow and be patted on the back and told what a good boy he is? I think that's not what is going on here, and we'll start to see what I think is. Now, many people call this chapter Samuel's farewell, but that's not accurate to call it Samuel's farewell. The reason is because Samuel doesn't die, and as we see it recorded, until 1 Samuel 25, verse 1, which is the very end of the book of Samuel. Okay, so what's going on here is there's a change of role that's occurring. Remember, Samuel was literally the last judge in the era of judges. Okay, therefore, he had multiple things he had to do, not the least of which is somehow organize or lead in some way Israel, the forces of Israel, the military elements of it into battles that occurred. Now, that is not what he's going to any longer do. Okay, why? Because of Saul.
Okay, right.
They already have a king. He's a military leader. He just showed he was a military leader in the previous chapter. Okay, he raised a 300,000 man army and annihilated the king of the Ammonites. So he will continue, though, acting as a priest and a prophet, and that's part of what he's doing in this chapter, actually. So he's a spiritual advisor now, okay, but not the leader of, let's call it, political Israel. Okay, they are going to start organizing into a political entity with Saul, with him setting laws in the future, with that him having a court of people, him starting a taxation system to raise money for the central government to obviously cover the cost of the army, and on and on and on and on. So Saul is going to now be the king and the military leader and the political leader. Samuel will be the spiritual leader. So that's really what we're seeing here. Now, Samuel starts this out as we read more, because he's going to indict the people over their disobedience and over their desire to want a king other than their own eternal king, Yahweh. Okay? Now, this is a very interesting issue, because as much as God obviously allowed a king, as much as he made a big deal about how to find a king, okay, as we've read in previous chapters, at the same time, he continues to indict them that they demanded a king. So it's an interesting element here we see between God's perfect will and his permissive will. Having a king was his permissive will, but not his perfect will. Okay? And he already warned them, as we'll see in a minute, what's going to happen if they get one. Now, so he starts, as we said, by proving his own innocence in his own ministry. And the reason why is because as we look into what verses 4 and 5 are going to tell us, the terminology that's used in the Hebrew, and especially verses 4 and 5, is that of a judicial hearing, a court. Okay? That's what the Hebrew's telling us is going on. Now, who's going to be the accused? All the people. Okay? Who's going to be the judge? Yahweh. Okay? Who's going to be the special prosecutor? Samuel. Okay? So this in Hebrew is what he's setting up here in these verses. And it actually goes into the next set also. So the people say, of course, we agree you're innocent. And it's interesting that they also talk about the word taken is used here multiple times. Defrauded you, taken from you, verse 4, or oppressed us, or taken anything from us. That's what the people said that Samuel didn't do. And so there's this emphasis on something being taken. Now, the word taken in Hebrew is the word lakwesh. Lakwesh. And its first use, interestingly, is in Genesis 2:22. Okay? And what is that? That is where we see the story of Adam having been created and him longing for a partner like himself. God finally consents to do so and puts him in a deep sleep and lakwesh out of his body a rib. God takes a rib, quote unquote, out of his body to make Eve. So that's the first interesting use of it. Now, also, of course, it's used in other places, and it's used both in a positive sense, like, for instance, it's used in areas where you're talking about to buy something, to marry someone, or to fetch something, are all also the word lakesh. Okay, but it's also used as in a negative way too. It also means to capture something, to steal something, or to remove from someone or something. It also means those things too. Now, I think there's an implication, again, hidden in the text about what this means. And remember that I had you go back, and let's do that now. I just think it's important to read it again. Let's go back to Genesis 35. Remember, in Genesis 35, if I can get back there, we have the story of Rachel's death. And drop down, and page there, drop down to verse 16. Then they journeyed from Bethel, and when they were still some distance to go to Ephrath, okay, Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered severe labor. And it came about when she was in severe labor that the midwife said, don't fear, for now you have another son. So apparently the baby crowned or something, and the midwife could tell that this is going to be another boy. Mm-hmm. So verse 19, verse 18. And it came about as her soul was departing, right before she died, okay, that she named her son Ben-Oni, which means the son of disappointment. Okay, it also means son of my sorrow or son of my misfortune, all those things.
This one says, or son of my strength.
Well, that's Benjamin.
Oh.
Which comes next.
Right, then Jacob immediately, hearing this and disagreeing with her naming of the son, says no. He says, but his father called him Benjamin, okay, which of course means son of my right hand, son of strength, etc. So since Saul is a son of Benjamin, right, tribe of Benjamin, so he's like all the tribe that are males, they're sons of Benjamin, okay. What we see here is that Saul has two destinies, and we're going to see this all the way through. He has a destiny where sometimes good things come from him, and he has a destiny where sometimes very bad things come from him. So he's, as I said before, he's really a very enigmatic figure, I think, in the Old Testament. Now, let's go ahead and go back to 1 Samuel chapter 12, and let's read verses 5 through 12. I'm sorry, 6 through 12. And Samuel said to the people, it's the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron, and who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt. So now take your stand, that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord, and he did for you and your fathers. Again, another image of a court. That God is the judge, Samuel is the prosecutor, and the people are the defendants. That's what's built into the Hebrew words there. It says, now Jacob went into Egypt, and your fathers cried out to the Lord. Then the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt, settling them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God, and he sold them again into the hand of Sisera, captain of the army of King Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of King of Moab, and they fought against them. So in other words, he's saying, even though God used supernatural strength and supernatural power to take them out of Egypt, having killed eventually a huge number, well, all of the firstborn, and also wreaking devastation on the economy of Egypt. They leave, and before not more than a couple days, because they've left, they end up complaining to the Lord. They end up seemingly in a short few days absolutely forgetting somehow his supernatural hand for them. And we're talking about days later, maybe a couple weeks, and yet all of a sudden they're complaining about water, they're complaining about food, they're complaining about the conditions, the heat, yada yada. Okay, so now, so the Lord, of course, as I said, gives them leaders to deliver the people, and very quickly they disobey. But he blesses them and acts in righteousness. Now, the word righteousness is very interesting. It's tzedekah, and it means the following things. It means mercy, it means kindness, it means, as we understand it, unmerited favor, and it also means, in our terminology in the New Testament, grace. Okay? So people that, again, somehow very mistakenly act like the Old Testament has no images or mention or teaching about grace, they're absolutely wrong. It has it all through. All right? But this includes both God's unconditional regard and love for his people. That's one part of it. But also, in that he never abandons them, he keeps his promises towards them, and they end up gaining his favor, not because they deserved it, but simply because he chose them. Now, we should see that there's another element of righteousness, and that means that it's supposed to lead to proper or righteous behavior from the people. So you're treated with righteousness and grace, but what it's supposed to cause in them is their own righteous behavior. Okay? In other words, that they will not do unrighteous acts either against the Lord or against their fellow Israelis. So it's interesting in this that the Jews tend to, in their teaching, that is the unsaved Jews, tend to emphasize what we'll call it lifestyle component of righteousness. In other words, they talk about how they can be more righteous. They set up codes for righteousness. They set up all kinds of rituals for righteousness. Okay, and of course, it's almost epitomized years and years later in the Pharisees, who did everything that they could do externally to view themselves as righteous, but as Christ said, you know, they're a whitewashed tomb. You know, the inside of the cup is filthy while the outside of the cup looks great. And indeed, that's what the Jews have emphasized. Now, it's interesting, Christians do something different. They emphasize the unconditional status of being in a relationship with God. Okay? In other words, I'm saved once and for all, eternally secure, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that both of them are true, and trying to express only one with the other is always a mistake. So that's what we're going to see here. Now, in verse 7, let's see, I haven't read all of 6 to 12, have I? Let's read it. Then Samuel said to the people, "It is the Lord who has appointed Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt. So now take your stand, that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord, which he did for you and your fathers." So he's now acting as the prosecutor against these defendants called Israel. And he's saying, number one, God never did you wrong. He blessed you. He made you covenant people. He did all these things for you. He never wronged you. And in verse 8, when Jacob went into Egypt and your fathers cried out to the Lord, then the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and settled them in this place. Verse 9, but they forgot the Lord their God, and he sold them into the hand of Sisera, captain of the army of King Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. And they cried out to the Lord and said, we have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and have served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. But now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you. Then the Lord sent Jerubbaal, Jerubbaal, and Bedan, and Jephthah, and Samuel, and delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around, so that you lived in security. So he's now referring, after he talked about Egypt and Moses and Aaron, then he talks about the era of the judges. Okay, we know that because so Sisera was the captain of King Jabin. We find this in Judges 4:2. And we also see here that he's talking about, he says, Jerubbaal, which is another ancient name for Gideon, another judge. And then he talks about Bedan, which in some manuscripts might be a manuscript error, but certainly not in all of them, copyist error, because who he's really referring to is Barak. But Bedan is not another name for Barak, so there may have been a little oops by some of the scribes when they, recopied the document. And then, of course, he talks about Jephthah. And finally, he names himself. Why? Because he's the last judge. So he says, he took you out of Egypt with great effort and supernatural acts. He put you, there was a conquest through Joshua. You then entered and had your tribal areas. Then what did you do? Very quickly. Disobeyed and turned against the Lord to idolatry. So what did God let happen?
Sold them into the hands of the enemies.
You're right. He sold them into the hands of the enemies.
Define sold.
Right, I was gonna ask that too.
Turned them over for a while.
Okay.
Let them do what they want. The wrath of abandonment.
Yeah, they abandoned the Lord didn't abandon them, but he used the nations around in each of these situations to punish them, to discipline them for their acts. So that's what occurs here. And all of this, of course, he connects to the fact that they insisted on a human king versus their eternal king. It's interesting, back in 1 Samuel 7, in verse 10, he said, now Samuel's offering up the burnt offering, and the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel, but the Lord thundered with a great thunder. You remember that when we studied that? So God, again, supernaturally acts to rid them of enemies, this time being the Philistines. They didn't have a standing army, okay? It was God, through these thunderings, that frightened the Philistines, and they ran. So God won the battle. That was maybe, I don't know, maybe a year or two prior, something like this. But even though that had just happened, what do they then continue to say? We need a human king. Even though God has shown overwhelmingly that if they obey, he will protect them against anyone. Okay? but they forget it very quickly. Now let's read back to 1 Samuel 12. Let's read 13 through 15. He says, now therefore, here is the king that you have chosen, whom you've asked for. And behold, the king has set and the Lord has set a king over you. If you'll fear the Lord and serve him, and listen to his voice, and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God. And if you will not listen to the Lord your God, but rebel against him, against his command, then the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your fathers. So he's saying here that, as I said before, it's an interesting theological issue here, because we like to believe that God gives his will, he makes it clear, people are to follow it, and that's the way it is. But what we see here is that God hears their desire, he allows them to get their desire in a human king, okay? He sets up the process in which to find that person, to make the human king, but at the same time, even though he does that, he turns around and condemns them for the fact that they even sought a human king and didn't trust him. So, again, you see many times that God does things that you would almost not expect him to do, but he does them or allows them, and therefore he works with the consequences of the very thing that the people chose. It's not going to go well. He already told them that, but he lets them do what they want. But exactly, but then he's going to, quote, as you said, teach them a lesson as a result of it when things go bad. So, Samuel, again, uses covenant language here, right? Covenant language is always if then. And look what he says in verse 14. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and listen to his voice and not rebel the command of the Lord, then both you and the king who reigns over you, etc., etc. So he uses covenant language as he's describing what's going to happen here. Now, the thing that we see that has happened and will continue to happen on and on and on is something that many theologians name the sin cycle. And it's perpetual through the Old Testament. God blesses, God directs, God leads, okay? They're initially thankful that he's delivered them. Then they're tempted, they worship idols, etc., etc. Then God disciplines them as a result of doing that until finally they repent, however long that takes, and then it starts all over again. And this is what we see scripted through this from one end to the other.
How many times did that happen?
Oh, gee.
5 times, 7 times?
No, way more than that. I mean, as you go through the whole Old Testament,
Right,
I mean, it's just perpetual.
right.
Look at David.
Are they
Okay.
that stubborn or that stupid?
Well, I think there's a better question to ask. Are we that stubborn? Because it doesn't end with them, right? How many people do you know that something wonderful has happened in their life they've been praying for, and they're thankful momentarily, and then something else occurs, and the first thing they do, of course, is to condemn God. Why aren't you acting? Why aren't you doing this for me? And many times turn away from it. Turn away temporarily in their walk,
Well,
over and over and over again.
I was gonna say 9/11 was kind of like that.
In a different way, yeah.
Right, I mean, everybody showed up in
Yeah.
the churches.
So basically, as I said, that In the Old Testament, God used kings and political entities to punish them. They were the enemies of Israel, which he used many of them over time. But the Lord also uses our enemy, Satan, and his minions to tempt, and as a result of being tempted, to correct us. Now, one of the very many misconceptions that goes on, and there are plenty of them, but one of them is the gospel of health and wealth, okay, which is a very big movement. Some of the biggest churches around, some of them with an auditorium of 30,000 people, teach this gospel of health and wealth. Well, sorry, but God doesn't guarantee health always. He certainly doesn't guarantee wealth necessarily. And he does allow things to occur to us for our chastisement and for the improvement of our character. So let me show you how he uses, and some of these verses are very well known, but turn to Ephesians. Turn to Ephesians chapter 6. I need to get there now. All right. You maybe have not thought of it this way exactly, but here's what Paul says is a part of the normal Christian life experience. Starting at chapter 6, verse 10. Chapter 6, starting verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord in the strength of whose might? His might. Same thing that Samuel just said to the people, didn't it? Okay. He says, put on the full armor of God that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. So what is he saying that's going to perpetually happen? One thing he says is perpetually going to happen is that we're always going to be dealing with the schemes of the devil. And he is crafty and tricky, and he is an expert at utilizing any flaws in our own character and exploiting them so that we do something stupid.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Perpetually. This is an ongoing battle. Okay? Now, he says also, again, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. And again, he goes through these levels of these demonic forces. And
cosmic and spiritual forces.
Yeah, cosmic and spiritual forces. So just as they had enemy in the leaders of countries that invaded them, we have our own enemy. Okay? And he is constantly trying to trick us and convince us of things that are not so. So, same principle. Now, why do we talk about, well, let me point one other thing too. Turn back to 2 Corinthians. I want to point out another thing, because some people might say, and I've heard it said, God, because we're in Christ now, God completely protects us from anything demonic or satanic occurring in our life or bothering us. And if you starting in verse 7 of 1 Corinthians 12, except I just turned to 2 Corinthians, all right, get there. Starting in verse 7, I wrote it down wrong. just a second, sorry.
Okay.
2 Corinthians. All right, there it is, 2 Corinthians 12:7. All right. Basically, this is Paul talking about the experience of his ministry. Okay. He has just had this vision, revelations from the Lord. He's now gone, apparently, or been transported in some way for a short period of time to heaven. He sees these heavenly things. As he said, verse 4, I was caught up in paradise and heard inexpressible words, which as man is not permitted to speak. Then look at 7. If you believe that God never uses the devil or any of his minions, what's this mean then? Because of the surpassing greatness of all the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, to keep me from exalting myself. All right? So, in the process of his ministry, and because of the information that he was given, then what happens is that the Lord allows a demon to torment him.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know exactly how, but that apparently is what's happening. So the enemy attacks, and this is the principle that we find. Now, also, in the New Testament, we call this Old Testament principle the discipline of the Lord. That's typically the word we use. So let's turn, if you're in 2 Corinthians, go back to 2 Timothy, go over to 2 Timothy. And you'll see a very important verse to always keep in mind. Chapter 3. Just a second here. Oh no. Well, I think I wrote that one down wrong. I think I did. Just a second. Okay, well, I am sorry. Absolutely wrote it down wrong, so I cannot quote that one. My mistake. So let's go to one of the most famous. That's Hebrews chapter 12. That one I wrote down correctly.
Hebrews 12.
Hebrews 12, starting verse 4. He says, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding of blood in your striving against sin. And you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines and scourges every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. If you want to have a strong walk and grow in Christ, you must endure his discipline at periods of time. God deals with you as with sons, for what son is there whom the Father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Furthermore, and he talks to an example in verse 9 of the earthly father. They discipline us, verse 10, for a short time as seemed fit to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. That's the key. The way to share his holiness is to be disciplined by the Lord so that he shapes you more and more into his image. That is Christian growth. Then verse 11, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful, yet to those who have been trained by it, afterward it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Again, back to that word, righteousness. Okay, back to 1 Samuel 12. Let's read 16 through 19. He says, even now, take your stand and see the great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest today? I will call to the Lord that he may send thunder and rain. Then you will know and see that your wickedness is great, with which you've done in the sight of the Lord by asking for yourselves a king. So Samuel called the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day. And all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. Then all the people said to Samuel, pray for your servants to the Lord your God, so that we may not die. For we have added to all our sins this evil by asking ourselves for a king. Now, remember, they're still at Gilgal, and it's the wheat harvest time. That would be approximately early June, would be the wheat harvest. Now, if you study a little bit about the climate of Israel, there are what's called early rains, which seem a little enigmatic to us because they occur sometime in middle or late October, which doesn't seem early, but you have to remember it's early in the Jewish calendar, which starts Tishri 1, right? So in their calendar system, those rains are soon after the, quote, Jewish New Year, and so they're early. Then there are spring rains. They are called the late rains. Now, during June, they almost never receive rain. The best you would ever hope for during the summer months would be a little downpour trickle, like a cloud, that bursts forth. There's a little bit of rain and then it's gone. That's the best or the most that will happen. But what happens here is that Samuel tells them, look what the Lord's going to do. And then he notes the time of year, that it's wheat harvest time. It never rains during wheat harvest. And what does he tell them that the Lord's going to do? Rain. And as a matter of fact, where it says that day, let's see. 18? Okay. Yeah, that's right. 18 that day. The image there in the Hebrew is that day long. In other words, it wasn't a brief shower and then dried off. It rained the whole day. It doesn't rain the whole day in that time of the year in Israel. Okay. And of course, it thundered. Now, they already know about thundering. They just heard God thundering a matter of, I don't know, maybe a year or so prior, okay, at that battle where God took on the Philistines. And so they know that thunder often refers to judgment. So they become frightened. Is God going to kill us? They ask Samuel. And he assures them, no, he's not going to kill you. But he states that what they need to pay attention to is their own behavior and their own obedience towards the Lord. And the fact of the thunders caused them to admit to their own wickedness and their own sin. They're terrified to be straight, to walk the straight and narrow path. So in verse 19, as we said, they fear they'll die. They admit their error of demanding the human king, of rejecting the leadership of their eternal king. And now let's read 20 through 25 and conclude this. Samuel said to the people, "Do not fear. You have committed all this evil, yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. And you must not turn aside, for then you would go after futile things, which cannot profit or deliver, because they are futile." This word is used twice in the same sentence. It has a significant meaning. We're going to look at it in a minute, or else it wouldn't be said twice and emphasized twice. "For the Lord will not abandon his people on account of his great name, because the Lord has been pleased to make you a people for himself. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you," he says, "but I will instruct you in the good and right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, both you and your king shall be swept away." So here's the last admonition of Samuel. So he assures them, of course, that they won't die, but they need to get serious about obeying the Lord. Now, also in verse 21, he warns the people not to seek, as we said, these futile things. It's an interesting word in the Hebrew. It's pronounced tohu. Okay? Tohu. It means literally something that is formless or empty or chaotic. And again, it starts out being used in a very interesting place. That would be Genesis 1, verse 2. And the earth was formless and void, right? That's what it's talked about. So we have this earth that is this massive, well, I won't go into this too much because we'd be here for hours. What we originally think is that out of water, because it's estimated that the amount of water, as you look at the amount of water estimated in the universe, that this is a ball of water that's probably half a light year in diameter. That's a lot of water.
Yeah.
Now, what you see, what is inevitable to the laws of physics, is you have that much mass in one place. What's it going to do? Well, it's going to put out a gravitational force, right? But that gravitational force with something that massive is going to cause it to contract on itself, implode.
Oh, okay.
Okay? As it implodes, it eventually heats up to the point that it's thermonuclear. And you have first fission, okay? No, you have first fusion, then fission, if I'm thinking about that. And what really happened is it condensed down and down and down. It got to the point where the forces inside were eventually balanced against the forces on the outside, and then it exploded. And when it exploded, what was left in the center was this formless void called the primitive earth. Okay? Now, what happens as we go through this? Honey, what happens? Well, as you go through this greater compression, you're ending up building the elements one by one. Because again, you add an electron and a proton and a neutron to the first thing, okay, hydrogen, then you get the second thing. And if you do it again, you get the third element. If you do it again, you get the fourth element. So eventually, all the elements are produced as a result of this huge collapse. Now, the interesting thing is, God looks at this and says, it's formless and void. Right at that point, it's of no good use. Okay? So what does he do? Then, over a period of the next days of the creation week, he then forms it into different things. He forms the oceans. He forms the landmass. He forms trees. Okay, and he keeps going through the days forming more things. So he's taking that which is a shadow, okay, I think it would be Bokar, and turns it into something more distinct, which is the word, I believe, if I haven't mixed them up, Erev. And this process goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until finally, at the end of the sixth day, there's a well-formed earth with trees and animals and rivers and oceans and streams, etc. Okay? Now, what he says here, though, is that we are not to be subjected or subject ourselves to futile things. Now, this obviously applies directly to idolatry, because idolatry is a futile thing. Okay? You're worshiping a man-made object. Okay? Where did that object come from? From the Lord. He created it. All right? That's where that object came from, the material for it. Okay? They didn't create the material for it out of nothing, although God did that. Okay? But they didn't do it. And so they end up worshiping, as Paul said in Romans 1, the creation rather than the creator. That's what they end up doing, right?
First time that's made sense to me.
Yeah.
Good. Now, it's interesting. God, through his process of further creation, he gives purpose and he gives love, meaning, and destiny to all people who believe in him. You know, one of the things that's often talked about, if you read the nerdy things that people write about, is they talk about needing to find their existential meaning for life. Notice the only reason why they have to find their existential meaning for their life. What does my life mean? What is my destiny? What should I do? All those, what we call existential questions. But the reason why they have to do that is because they did something before it. They forsook the Lord.
Right.
Right. And because they forsook him and don't believe in him and don't have a relationship with him, then it starts all of their existential problems, which they try to fill through philosophy and other religious practices and all these things that are attempted to do. So the point is that those that don't believe in God are left to a life of meaninglessness. Now, they try to fill it with some type of pseudo meaning. Okay, look at the great car I just got, whatever. Okay, but it's still meaningless because they can't answer any of the questions that their life has for them. What do I do? How do I fit in? Who am I? What's the meaning of my life? Is my life significant? You know, what is that significance? Okay, but we as believers have all those questions answered. We know that there was a beginning to life. We know how it's going to end. Okay, we know how Satan came to be into being. All right, we know why he became the tempter and our adversary, which is what his name literally means, the adversary. We know all these things because from the eternal mind of our Creator God, he told us all these things. We didn't have to figure them out because in reality, we couldn't even figure them out. But he tells us these things and tells us what playing field we're on and why we're here and what we're doing and who our enemy is on this playing field called the earth. Okay? So, we can see here the very significant statement: don't do things that are futile. And not believing in God is the ultimate in futility. When you have to come up with stuff that's just absolutely crazy. One of those crazy things is the theory of evolution, because it's nuts. I mean, I studied it a long time, and I know the components of it. I know what's taught originally by Darwin in his book, but in reality, it answers nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Creates more questions.
It creates more questions, is all it does. And again, it creates an attitude that is tragic, and that is, since there's no meaning, since there's no morality, then some people take it upon themselves to do whatever they want to do. And we're back to the last chapter of Judges. And there was no king in Israel at that time, and everyone did what was right in his own sight. Is that not where we're at today?
Yeah.
In our culture?
Yeah.
People do what is right in their own sight,
And
I think it's right.
not what God would have them do.
Mhm. Right.
Okay. Now, in verse 22, Samuel assures them that the Lord will not abandon them. And for two reasons. It's interesting what the reasons are. He won't abandon, one, because this was his decision to start this whole process beginning in Genesis 1:1. He's going to finish what he starts. Now, a curveball was thrown into the original intent. Okay, there were actually two of them. One curveball was the fall of Satan and the fact that he rebelled against the Lord. And the second curveball was what he created in the garden. Right? There are two curveballs that were thrown into the design and the process. But despite that, God has a way to bring it about and has a plan to bring it all about. And that's indeed exactly what he's going to do. The second reason why he's not going to abandon his people is because he has to defend his great name. In other words, he's the one that started the process.
Mhm.
Okay? And the whole spiritual realm is looking at us. And they're looking and saying, what's he going to do with them? Okay? In many different areas, what's he going to do with them? But the point is, God is obligated to his own character. And he's going to prove the intent of this character and the reality of his character to the entire spiritual universe. Therefore, he can't go back. There ain't no going back. God's plan will continue. So, in the same way, of course, Samuel won't abandon his ministry. And we see that where he says, let's see, where does he say, I continue to pray for you. Okay, 23. He says, moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you. But I will instruct you in good and the right way. So again, he's saying, I haven't quit. My ministry's not over yet. It's going to continue, but it's going to continue to be a little different than it was originally. And that's what he says. And indeed, more years go by as he continues to instruct and teach and admonish the people. And then he says, of course, he says, only, verse 24, only fear the Lord and serve him in truth and all your heart, for consider what great things he's done for you. This, of course, is a universal statement that's true of all people. Jews, believing Gentiles, it's universal for all people. It sounds a bit like Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 6, which we call the Great Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and your neighbor as yourself. Well, he doesn't say neighbor himself right there, I'm sorry. But that's what's called the Great Shema. And this has seemingly elements, parallels to the Great Shema. Now, the perfect fulfillment of all this is in the New Testament, and one of the places it's found is in Romans chapter 5. So why don't you go there? Romans chapter 5. Okay, if I can get there. Romans 5. We're going to read starting at verse 8. But God demonstrates his own love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That's his grace. No merit. We were literally Paul tells us we were the enemies of God, and yet he still sent his son to pay for our sins that we accumulated. Then in verse 10, for if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his son, much more having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. So God not only didn't punish us eternally for turning against him and sinning, but rather he sent the solution, named Jesus Christ, okay, who would pay for all sins, and therefore that we would continue, therefore, in that sense, in the grace of God. Again, the cycle of sin. You're going to see as we go further in these chapters, and even beyond it, the cycle of sin over and over and over again. So, okay, let me stop and let me pray, and we will end this time. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you that we do not live in futility, that you've given us meaning, you've given us truth, you've given us your love, you've predicted even the future in various ways for us, and you tell us without fail how it's going to end. Very clearly you tell us how it's all going to end. So thank you for not putting us in a meaningless universe where each life would come to no good, no ultimate meaning. So we thank you for these things tonight and pray in Christ's name. Amen.